My name is Rosa Maria Carranza. I am Salvadorian. I have been here for 35 years. 24 years with a TPS work permit. So it is important that we understand how the system works in the United States. Thanks to attending school here, I went to City College. I got my Associate of Art in Child Development and Family Studies and my permit as a site supervisor in early childhood education. So I have to thank my instructors for that. So thanks to them, I learned more than I knew when I came. So I came in 1991, running for the Civil War in our country. And I stay here trying to do better for me and for my family. So it is painful for any immigrant worker in the United States when you don't have a legal status in this country and you leave your loved one behind without any way of going back because you cannot come back here again. So this is my case. Being in the community and doing the best, giving the best of us to grow up in this country, to do something to provide our families in the United States and out of the United States with the support they need. So again, thank you, and we have our first speaker, Dr. Ong, is that correct? Okay, thank you so much. Welcome, Dr. Ong. Thank you.
So, nice to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you as well.
I am not about to teach you how to organize, but I'm gonna comment on the tasks at hand. Every day, I don't know about you, but every day my email box, I'm still an email person, is filled with what's happening, right? And it's usually not good, and it can range from what the Supreme Court did yesterday on birthright citizenship to the deportation of people to South Sudan, which my immigration clinic is actually representing two of those people. One was going to be sent to Libya. He ended up in Laos, and then we're representing one who's on the ground in Djibouti right now, who they're trying to put in South Sudan. Or what's happening at the immigration courts locally, which is crazy. And so the simple truth is that with Trump in power, every day this is going to happen. And I don't mean this as a compliment, but I'm impressed. I am really impressed by the range and the number of things that they've come up with. It's not him. How did they come? People tell me, oh, well, they had 4 years to plan. I don't know, how were they so confident that they were going to win? But maybe because I'm just so impressed by their ability to get into the weeds and to affect everything, and the fact that Stephen Miller fired 2 people at ICE a couple weeks ago because they weren't arresting 3,000 people a day, and now they're well over 2,000 people a day that they're arresting. And so really, what is this about? Well, what is this about in terms of this room? Well, it's a reminder that we can't sit still, that it's time for us to organize and to be part of the resistance. And that in order for us, we're not going to help the community by sitting on our hands and whining and complaining. We actually all have to get up and start helping. And so this is about working with Rosa and her compatriots. It's funny that you should mention the Ukrainians, because I have some of my students are here who are working with me this summer. Another group of my students is working with Ukrainians because they're next, they feel. And they admit that to the racism that's occurring, and that there's somehow not, ICE is not floating around Ukrainian neighborhoods in Southern California and other places. But they also have convinced me, and others, it doesn't take much convincing, that Trump is not going to do Ukrainians favors in the United States, and that it's pretty clear that he will not extend Ukrainian TPS when it's up in a year and a half, I think. And so, so what are some of the goals, and why do we need to engage in resistance? Well, some of what I'm about to say is obvious, right? We need to aid in the defense of human rights, because resistance helps to protect fundamental rights and freedoms that often get suppressed under oppressive regimes, such as freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, like what we're doing here, and due process that Leslie Rose and I, we have to debate whether or not due process is here to stay or not. So far, and again, we would probably engage in an interesting debate over how much the Supreme Court is willing. What does due process mean to the Supreme Court, and whether or not that will be, is it sufficient due process that when you deport 200 people to El Salvador who are not from El Salvador without any hearings, is it sufficient due process for the Supreme Court to say, well, you know, you can't deport them without some kind of hearing, but only where they were detained, and only by doing a difficult procedure for most attorneys, which is to go into federal court and file a writ of habeas corpus. That's not something that most lawyers are accustomed to doing. And so defense of human rights. The other is preventing normalization. We don't want what's happening by the Trump administration to be considered normal, right? We have to resist, because if we don't resist, then this kind of authoritarian process becomes normal, and then the public can become apathetic. And I'm careful when I say that, because I believe two things that seem inconsistent. That it's very easy for segments of the American public to become apathetic when it's not affecting them personally. But I also believe, again, these two things can be true, but I also believe that the vast majority of Americans, if they know the information, that they can be convinced to align with us. If I didn't believe that, then, if I didn't believe that the vast majority of Americans can change their minds and be affected, then it would be hopeless for me. And I want to believe that. I want to believe that a majority of the American public is capable of being moved with the right information. And part of the reason we want to engage in resistance is in order to work with groups that have been historically oppressed, subordinated, whatever adjective you want to use, because while they may be able to do it on their own, it's easier through collaboration, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And I don't have to remind us, but without resistance, many of the great historical changes, many in your lifetime, even the young people in the room, civil rights, decolonization, democratic transitions, gay and lesbian rights, many of those did not happen without organized resistance. We also have to engage in resistance to keep moral accountability on the table, that the immoral actions that are taken by the Trump administration, including outright lies, we have to constantly expose that and put it on the table for the rest of the American public and for people beyond our borders that might have some influence. We have to engage in disruption of unjust systems, because without civil protests and disobedience, strikes, legal challenges, they don't move, and so we have to do everything that we can to disrupt. And we also have to engage in resistance in order to maintain a record of truth, and maintain a record for purposes of historical memory. That it is resistance that enables us to keep a memory that counters the propaganda and preserves the stories of people that are affected. And that's part of resistance. That's part of, and I spoke with a group of progressive journalists 3 weeks ago at a conference in Berkeley, and one question was troubling, and the question that was asked by a journalist was, you know, we're trained to be objective and neutral when we write our stories, and so when we write our stories, don't we have to write about, well, there's a violation of the law, and then this is a person who violated the law, and that's why they're arrested. And so here's the problem with your premise. The problem with your premise is that you're accepting that the law, when it was written neutrally. And that's the problem. That the vast majority of immigration laws are a reflection of systemic racism. I can name 10 different immigration laws that don't sound racist, but they were intentionally passed at a time when it was mostly Mexicans that were crossing the border illegally. Just 2 examples. One, if you are married to a US citizen, you would think that you could immediately apply for a green card. You would be right if that prospective immigrant entered the country with a visitor's visa or student visa and overstayed 20 years ago, okay?
Wow.
If you married a US citizen and you overstayed your visa, your student visa or visitor's visa 20 years ago, you can apply for your green card today. Adjustment of status in the United States. But if the person who wants to apply enters without inspection along the border and then married a US citizen, they can't apply here. Because there's a law that says in order to be eligible for adjustment of status, you have to have entered with inspection. And guess who was entering without inspection when they passed that law? It was Mexicans, okay? That's why they passed that law, was to punish Mexicans. The problem is, you might think, oh, well then what's the big deal? They can just go to Mexico and process their visa. The problem is that there's a law that once you leave and you've been here undocumented for a year, you're subject to a 10-year bar, okay? So it's a trap. Another example, and I'm forgetting which Castro ran for president against Joe Biden. One of the twin brothers from Texas, Julian Castro, I can't remember, was running for president. He pointed to another provision. It was entry without inspection. Entry without inspection is a misdemeanor, okay? And so, guess who were the people that usually entered without inspection when that, well, it's Mexicans, okay? I can go on and on. And so, that's the problem with a journalist saying that they've got to start from, I said, no, if you want to start objectively, well, you start by telling where that law came from. And that law was a racist law, and that's what's being enforced today. So, finally, this is one final bullet point. I'm not finished talking. That we need to resist in order to take the offensive. That we should not stand by and just be constantly reacting and defending. I love that what I think you're doing today, at least the invitation to me said this, that we're all gathered here today in order to develop a strategy for legalization for everyone, not just TPS holders, but DACA recipients and people who are in other people who entered with humanitarian parole. And so, so that's what we should be engaged in, is a movement to do something affirmative. When I was a little kid, I actually met a Chinese philosopher, and his name, and I've written about him actually. His name is Y.C. Chen, and he wrote this. It's almost a poem. He was, believe it or not, he was a community organizer in China. Okay, and he was trying to resist 1949. That's how old he was. And for those of you in the room, 1949 is when the communists took over China. And whether or not you agree or disagree with what happened after that is beside the point. The point is that he was trying to organize resistance. And so his poem was that you go to the people, you live among them, you learn from them, you love them, you serve them, you plan with them, you start with what they know, and you build on what they have. And in my line of work, that his poem is what we today would label rebellious lawyering. And I used to teach a class called rebellious lawyering, and students always misunderstood what that term meant, because they thought rebellious lawyering only meant rebelling against the bad guy and rebelling against the government and rebelling against the landlord. Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of it, but rebellious lawyering is actually rebelling against conventional lawyering. That's what the main theme is, to instead of being a conventional lawyer, to actually start from a position of humility. And how many of you have met lawyers who start from a position of humility? Maybe Leslie Rose is, but those elements come down to educating yourselves, educating the community you're working with to support resistance. And so it's about combating. It's about combating subordination. And you know, recently I had my students look at this documentary on TPS, and maybe you've seen it, Rose. It's called Almost American.
Yeah, I haven't watched it.
Yeah, well, I just forwarded a free version of it to the TPS Coalition email, and so please forward it to the people that are attending today, because I think it's really eye-opening about the need. So also it's about opening ourselves to be educated by the folks that we work with. So it's about, as I said, I'm repeating myself, demonstrating humility in our work to start with those who are affected by the policies. And it's also about working in collaboration. So it's respecting the folks, their knowledge and ability. We don't know it all, okay? In fact, they know much more, and they can help provide more information than we could ever do to advocate. And so it's starting with that. It's working as co-eminent workers and partners, as problem solvers, and working in what some might call a third dimension of advocacy, where it's not unidirectional. It's not we just helping some group. It's actually us working in partnership. And it's respecting the folks that we work with and not repeating the subordinating experience that they've often endured up until the time that we're working with them in the same room. It's so easy for many of us who are privileged to think that, oh, well, we know, we've been through this before, and that's wrong-headed. And once you give off that vibe, you're subordinating that person again, and you've got to catch yourself. You've got to realize that you have as much to learn from them as they might have to learn from you, and sometimes probably not as much that they can learn from us. The rebellious advocacy is also about not being afraid to take on seemingly the most challenging challenges that are impossible to accomplish, okay? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, even though you say, how in the world can we bring down Trump? How in the world could we stand up to the government? Don't be afraid to take on the most challenging circumstances. You have to start somewhere, and it's about coming up with the strategy and maybe even beginning with the edges and not just at the center. But that's what strategy is about, and don't be afraid of doing that. A second ago, I was speaking with the Roses about, and my friends from Mission Advocacy, about the Japanese internment situation. And many of you may not know this, but Japanese Americans who were survivors of the internment, they had a successful advocacy program where they ended up getting an apology for internment and a $2,000 payment. Now that's not much money, but a $2,000 payment from the Reagan administration for internment. And the Attorney General, you can look this up on Google, Attorney General Richard Thornburg got on his knees and apologized to Japanese survivors of internment. How did they accomplish that? Because who would have said, oh, you know what, you survivors, you're going to get an apology from the president and from Congress, and the Attorney General is going to bow to you and hand you a $2,000. You're nuts. We're not going to be able to. You know what? They did that. They accomplished the impossible. And so we can do that.
I want to thank the folks at Carecen, the Latino Task Force, the Living Wage Coalition, NorCal TPS Coalition, SEU Local 87, all of our labor partners, and the National TPS Alliance for your work to advocate for our communities. Given the overwhelming support on this resolution thus far, we will very likely have a unanimous vote at the board today. And that is because of all the amazing people that have been organizing day in and day out for our immigrant communities. The Board of Supervisors has come together time and again to demonstrate unwavering support for immigrants' rights. This year we've passed several resolutions affirming our sanctuary laws, and we will continue to do so as long as we need to demonstrate our solidarity and commitment to our sanctuary city, no matter what nonsense is coming out of the president's mouth. Any of the current countries that receive temporary protected status directly affects our immigrant communities in San Francisco. Many TPS holders are also essential workers who provide care for patients in our hospitals, take care of our children and elders, among other countless contributions. And we also must demand that our California leaders in Washington push for continued TPS protections and a pathway to citizenship.
Es Enrina Vivas Castillo, soy tepeciana, venezolana, y soy una de las demandantes de la Alianza Nacional. Soy una de las demandantes en el caso de la Alianza Nacional TPS contra Cristín No. Soy madre de una hija y actualmente mis padres dependen de mí. En Venezuela, yo era socia de una fábrica, pero tuvimos constantes problemas políticos por la crisis económica. Mi comunidad y yo Fuimos aterrorizados por el gobierno venezolano durante años por expresar nuestras opiniones políticas. El TPS me permitió vivir en un lugar seguro y estable. A través del TPS conseguí trabajo como conductora de entrega y me uní a un sindicato. Con TPS pude ayudar a mi familia y contribuir a mi comunidad. Desde que fue revocado el TPS en Venezuela, estaba consumida en el estrés, ansiedad. Perdí mi trabajo como conductora y mi vivienda. Lo peor de todo fue el terror de ser detenida y deportada. Vivo en Los Ángeles. Y solo unas semanas después de perder nuestra protección del TPS, comenzaron las redadas en Los Ángeles. Horrible. Tenía miedo de salir de casa, temiendo que la gente a mi alrededor pudiera ser un agente de ICE, a punto de agarrarme. Ni siquiera podía dormir, temiendo que en cuanto cerrara mis ojos, un agente enmascarado derrimara mi puerta y en plena noche y me llevara. Sentí que viví este terror por segunda vez en Venezuela. Viví con el temor de ser arrestada, detenida injustamente por un presidente que violaba la ley. Ahora, una vez más, vivía con el temor de ser arrestada y detenida. Me uní con la demanda de la Alianza Nacional de TPS contra NON porque tenía que hacer algo para enfrentar este ataque contra los tepecianos. Este programa me parece importante porque protege a personas como yo, que no tienen dónde acudir en este país. Me encuentro aquí para defender nuestros derechos y nuestro futuro. Gracias.